Welcome, everyone. So glad that you're coming to have a look at our presentation on FrameNet and typology. Basic idea, we're a large semantic resource. FrameNet is a large semantic resource, manually created, both in terms of the frames that we've made and in terms of the annotation that we've done, which validates the frames and the relationships between those frames. The Berkeley FrameNet frames are already used cross-linguistically. There are large FrameNet-based projects for several European and Asian languages. FrameNet Brazil has created extensions of Berkeley FrameNet for sports and tourism. Berkeley FrameNet frames are found to be largely cross-linguistically applicable in all of these projects. Using FrameNet annotation for detailed typological work should be possible, and we're going to show some examples of that. And then there should be the underlying question of how comparable are these frames? That should be a question that typologists want to know, and we try to address that question with a tool, ViToXF, that tries to quantify the comparability of frames. The outline, we're going to start with Intro to FrameNet and Multilingual FrameNet. There's previous work on the Hound of the Baskervilles spatial language study. Then we talk about cross-linguistic annotation of the TED Talk. Then we talk about how we're trying to prove comparability of frames with ViToXF. And then we're going to open it up for discussion of how suitable FrameNet is for semantic typology. FrameNet is a project focusing on analyzing lexical units, which are defined as lemmas that evoke particular frames. Semantic frames are things like giving, where a donor transfers a theme from a donor to a recipient, and commerce sell, where a seller sells goods to a buyer for money. You can, without too much reflection, see that those should be semantically related, and they are in our network. Commerce sell inherits from giving, but there are other frames in our network, including things like there's a commerce sell as a perspective on a commerce goods transfer, which itself is a sub-event of commercial transaction. There's a network of universally relevant frames, things like causation, motion, perception, mental activity, emotions. But then there's more specific frames in the network as well, including things like endangering or morality evaluation. And the reason why that's important is because some of these more detailed frames interact with multiple of these universally relevant frames. So you can do work and simultaneously address these universals while looking at detailed vocabulary. So in the work of the Multilingual FrameNet project included harmonizing data of the large FrameNet project. So this is English, Brazilian, Portuguese, French, German, Spanish, and Swedish FrameNets, which studied Indo-European languages, but as well it includes Chinese FrameNet and Japanese FrameNet, which are not Indo-European. The annotation data is unfortunately not available for all languages due to copyright and other issues. But the joint annotation of the TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity, is to be open. And that includes English, Brazilian, Portuguese, Japanese, German, and French. And our project also produced tools for viewing and analyzing these frames and the annotation cross-linguistically. Just to motivate the idea that FrameNet could be used in typology, I'm going to outline a study we did of chapter 14 in the Hound of the Baskervilles of spatial language. The languages involved there were English, Spanish, Japanese, and German. And you can use FrameNet to find expected patterns of verb framed versus satellite framed languages. So that, for example, the arriving frame is a clear example of verb framing. It's found 30 times in Spanish versus only 6 times in English. And this is typical of a number of verb-framed frames in English versus Spanish. Not surprisingly, German is indistinguishable from English in this annotation. And also not surprisingly, Japanese used frequent chain verbs encoding manner and path jointly. But in some work that we don't believe has been discussed in the typological literature, Spanish and Japanese added posture description that wasn't explicit in English. And finally, Japanese sometimes took a holistic view rather than encoding motion at all, profiling change of shape like spreading and visibility disappearing. And I'm going to show a detailed example of this last example. So here you can see the original English. As we watched it, the fog wreaths came crawling around both corners of the house and rolled slowly into one dense bank. Here you can see a motion frame, self-motion, path, and moving in place. In the Japanese, the translation, which you can see in C at the bottom, eventually the whole area became slightly blurry and was gradually wrapped up in the fog, especially as the white fog crept low on the ground. So this involves some frames that weren't present in English, like filling, which has a lexical unit that's translated as wrap up, and a change visibility frame with a lexical unit translated with become blurry. So as far as we know, this is not a typological pattern that has been outlined and has not been profiled as a difference between Japanese and English. Then we also, as part of Multilingual FrameNet, did a TED Talk annotation where we annotated all semantic domains in a TED Talk called Do Schools Kill Creativity? In English, Brazilian Portuguese, Japanese, German, and French. We used the Berkeley FrameNet release 1.7 as the source for all the frames in all the languages. But we did add annotation even for cases where the frames in 1.7 were not an exact match, using a best fit frame. When we did that, the annotation counts are not comparable because there was no control on which of the best fit frames people might use out of many candidates. There's an ongoing analysis. We found a number of frame shifts, which you can find outlined in part in our paper with this talk. Finally, we produced a tool, ViToXF, that aims to quantify how related and how comparable frames are across languages. So I give you two examples here. One of them is an example where there's a frame in Spanish FrameNet, motion up downwards, that is not present in English. And the question is, can this tool match to the clearly most relevant English frame, which is motion directional? You can see if you choose the right settings, you can choose the scoring technique, synset count, which is based on WordNet. You can choose a score threshold of 0.2. And with those settings, you can get motion directional as one of the matched frames. And that works pretty reasonably. In our second example, you can see Spanish FrameNet breathing, which should be an exact match to the Berkeley FrameNet breathing frame. In this case, we used LU similarity based on word vectors. We chose a score threshold of 0.1. And with those settings, we can have English breathing as a comparable frame. However, it's very sensitive to this scoring threshold. If we change it to be any tighter, then breathing in English disappears as a comparison for Spanish breathing. So they're relatively fragile. We still need to do more work on how well the word vectors work. So in sum, we think FrameNet is relevant for typology as it covers most domains. It's ready to use for annotation. Typologists can define new frames and compare them to existing frames using formal frame-to-frame relations. Annotating parallel or comparable texts can confirm or refute typological differences. And full annotation, in particular semantic domains or of all domains, can reveal patterns of frame shift and might suggest new hypotheses to typologists for typological differences. Here's some URLs for our projects that all contributed. And thanks to all of you, and thanks especially to all the FrameNetters on all the projects that made this work possible.